Hi, I'm KA. This is the Service Design Show, and this is episode 220.
We've all been there, right? That moment when an interesting project lands in your inbox and you're just itching to dive in. But what if that project, despite your best intentions, is actually outside of your scope of practice? What if, by saying yes, you are actually setting yourself up for failure, or even worse, causing unintended harm? That's the gnarly topic we'll be exploring today. Hi, if you're new here, welcome to the Service Design Show, where we invite the brightest minds in our field and explore what's truly needed to design great services that resonate with people, push our businesses forward, and honor our planet. Today, we are diving deep into a topic that's close to my heart: the importance of scope of practice in service design. It's about understanding our boundaries and making sure we're using our skills responsibly. Joining us is K.A. McKercher, a true innovator in our field. You might know K.A. from their groundbreaking book Beyond Sticky Notes, or their presentations at conferences around the world. But what you might not know is that early in their career, K.A. had a humbling experience that completely changed their approach to service design. They realized that good intentions aren't always enough, especially in sensitive situations. K.A. is now a passionate advocate for ethical design, emphasizing the importance of knowing when to step back and when to collaborate. They're also a dedicated educator, equipping the next generation of designers to make a real difference. In this episode, we'll explore KA's insights on the scope of practice, ethical curiosity, and how we can all practice service design more responsibly. You'll hear how to become more self-aware as a designer without the imposter syndrome, practical ways to decide if a project is right for you, the power of co-facilitation in different cultures, how to avoid causing harm when working with communities, why co-facilitation isn't a magic bullet and what it really takes to be responsible, how to confidently say no to projects that aren't a good fit, finally, why a beginner's mindset isn't always best and when you need to do your homework first. Now, I've got to admit, one thing that really struck me in this conversation was their balance between self-reflection and imposter syndrome. K.A. talks about how important it is to be critical of our own skills and the projects we take on, but also how that can sometimes lead to self-doubt. It's a tricky tightrope to walk, and I think K.A. offers some really valuable insights on how to navigate that. All in all, some great food for thought on how to approach your work with both confidence and humility. Before we dive in, I want to mention that this episode touches on sensitive topics like psychosis, suicide, and child protection. If these topics are difficult for you, you might want to skip this episode or listen with some extra care. Enough from me. I can't wait for you to hear what K.A. has to say about the scope of practice and ethical design. I'm your host, Mark Fontein, and you are listening to the Service Design Show. K.A., you mentioned in the notes that you shared with me, and I'm going to quote, that our good intentions aren't good enough and the scope of our practice matters. Please elaborate a bit for us on what you mean with that.
Yeah, sure. And thanks for having me. So I think as designers, we have this really wide and broad scope as service designers where we've been sort of told that we can go into any sort of situation and context and bring our service design skills with us. And there's some services and some contexts where that's maybe okay, but there's also a whole heap of other contexts that are really sensitive contexts like child protection or domestic violence or gender affirming care that require us to have more sensitivity, more context awareness to be able to practice in a really kind of safe and responsible way that respects people's time, that understands what people are really saying, because sometimes what people are saying is so contextually specific that we might not understand it if we haven't been deeply in that context. And the idea of a scope of practice comes from health and social care, where, you know, if you go to a doctor, that doctor is very clear with you about the things they can and can't do. And if you start asking for a kind of specialization or a procedure that they can't perform, they'll say to you, like, that's outside my scope of practice, but I can refer you on to Dr. So-and-so who does that particular procedure. We don't kind of have that concept in service design. We just kind of, go around using our skills, but not being very transparent about what actually is within our scope of practice, the kind of skills we have, the identities we bring to the work, as well as the things we don't know how to do. And an example of that might be, it's really different to be a workshop facilitator to a conflict mediator. And sometimes, depending on who we're working with and what the context is, something really different might start to emerge. And I think to practice responsibly, we need to be able to notice that, name that, and draw in others, or maybe step away from that context if we don't have the competency.
So many questions already around this. But first, I would like to explore what made you, the question is, take us through your journey and how you came to the realization that this actually matters.
Yeah, it was a painful one. So when I had just graduated design school, I was so excited and so eager about design. And the kind of design training I had sort of taught us that designers were quite magical and that we had these huge number of tools in our toolkit and we could just go off and kind of use them on the world and use them on communities. And I was invited into a project that was a child protection reform project. I won't talk about any kind of details of trauma or anything, just the context. And the only projects I'd done up until then were usability testing projects, user experience projects in like retail and insurance and banking. And I suddenly found myself standing in a cultural place called Mudeye back home in Aotearoa, New Zealand, surrounded by police officers and teachers and tribal leaders who were all talking about this incredibly complex context of child protection. And I found myself there with all my sticky notes, all my butcher's paper. I'd spent like months and months preparing for this first workshop. I got up, I started introducing myself, and a cultural leader stood up and said, like, "Who are you? Sit down." And I was like, oh, I've gotten actually quite confused about authority. And I thought because the client asked me to be here, that was the same as community wanting me to be there. And this project it really didn't kind of go very well because I didn't know anything other than some lived experiences in my family with the child protection system about how that operated. And I just wasn't very useful to the process. And I began to sort of see how when we're not quite the right person, when we don't have the right kinds of competencies, we can kind of waste other people's time. But it also exposed me as like a 19-year-old probably to a whole heap of quite traumatic material that I had absolutely no context to understand because I'd been trained as a designer, not a social worker.
Thank you for sharing that. And you sort of maybe even got lucky to have that experience early on in your career. When you, like one of the things that you often hear in the service design practice is that we don't have to be the experts around a specific subject matter. We are there to facilitate and to draw out the lived experience, the expertise from within the people who we're working with. How does that align to how you see design?
Yeah, I think that's a nonsense. I think that's something we need to stop deceiving ourselves about. Like maybe if you're facilitating a vacuum cleaner redesign process or maybe a banking redesign process or insurance, like maybe it's okay to sort of come in and bring our skill set, which is a fantastic skill set, like both our mindsets, our curiosity, but also our actual technical skills, our processes are really effective. But I sort of see it this way, that when we come into a context and we know so little, we spend a lot of time getting other people to educate us so we can then start being useful to them. And I think that's kind of a problem, because actually, with the right kind of expertise, when we do come into context as service designers, when we know a context a little bit more, maybe we also have a lived experience in that context, we bring with us kind of all this more nuanced knowledge that means we can start the conversation like here instead of all the way back here, and ask everyone to kind of come with us as we rediscover. I guess I also have read over in my role, I provide a lot of supervision to practitioners, and I've read over so many service design reports that were clearly very interesting to the people writing them, but not very interesting to the people in the system that actually need to understand and act on those insights. Sometimes because of just their obviousness, and sometimes obvious insights can be useful. They can help us to notice things in a new way. But other times they just kind of waste people's time and can be quite disheartening when we come into a context, especially a really sensitive one, and we see a facilitator really not understanding things that are cultural or community specific processes. And I'll give you an example here is a few years ago, I was invited as a community member into a process to redesign our state LGBTQ health service plan. And the facilitators, I don't know if they were from community. It didn't really feel like that, because one of the very first things they got the group of people to do is they put out a whole bunch of things on the table and said, these are all problems that you have. Can you just sort out these problems and tell us which ones are the worst? And that's really kind of a callous way to approach community that has strengths and resilience and resistance, as well as kind of health inequalities as well. So I think we can be quite unskillful and even unconsciously incompetent, which is kind of a scary place to be, because we kind of don't even know, but people talk about us behind our backs maybe.
The other thing we often say is like we bring a beginner's mind, a fresh perspective. So because we are not experts in a specific field, we can ask the silly questions. And how do you see that? Where it's a gray area to being an expert or being part of a community towards being like trying to be super objective and not knowing anything. What's good enough?
Yeah, and I think we need to be asking some questions about who might our naivety or who might our beginner's mindset cause real harm to. Because when we step into these kind of more sensitive contexts of service design, there are often advocates and workers in those spaces who have been advocating for things for like 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years. And they often have a huge volume of research that's already been done, very clear recommendations for action. And it's actually quite offensive to have someone come along and say, we haven't really done design research on that. So let me take you back to that point. I think the beginner's mindset has value, and it really worries me that we learn by doing on people who are made vulnerable by systems. And I wonder in that context whether a safer way to practice, if we are still going to be there, and I question if we should be, is to co-facilitate. Because co-facilitation is this amazing relationship where we maybe get to be deeply alongside someone who has heaps more context knowledge than we do, or has a lived experience that we don't have. And the relationships I've enjoyed most in my career, especially when I maybe have part of the lived experience needed but not the full thing, is to have a lived experience co-facilitator, because I'm learning so much with them about how they see the world and how to shift my methods and approaches to be most accessible to the community we're working with. And then they're also learning about a whole bunch of design and facilitation and project management kind of things that I have in my toolkit, but we're working together about how best to adapt those tools and processes to the specific context or community.
Can you elaborate a little bit more on what does co-facilitation, how is it different to the quote unquote regular design process?
Yeah, so I think in the regular design process, which is often a human-centered design process or a user-centered design process, sometimes a co-design process, that we as designers would do the workshop design, the agenda, we would run the activities, we would take them away, we would do maybe the analysis, the synthesis, the reporting. In a co-facilitation relationship, someone with lived or living experience is working alongside us throughout that process and kind of keeping us honest. I'll give you an example. I've recently been working with a really fantastic lived experience practitioner called Shan Watson, and we've been working on a LGBTQ cancer project. And I am a queer person, but I don't have a lived experience of cancer. Shan does. So they've very deeply been bringing that lived experience with them throughout the work. And we planned all the workshops together. We ran those workshops together. We did the analysis together. We did the writing process together. We did all the testing together. And now we're doing all the reporting together. And it's just miles off what I could have ever created, because it is not my lived experience cancer.
Yeah, they're part of a team instead of the people who we're designing maybe with or for, like they are the team, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
You already mentioned a few things, but I think it's good to sort of take a moment to emphasize what the potential consequences might be of using our beginner's mind, maybe a naive approach in, you mentioned sensitive context. So can you bring this home, like maybe with some examples of what potential damage or harm we might do if we're not aware of the fact?
I want to mention first the notion of ethical curiosity, because I think it links to, or appropriate curiosity, because I think it links to this conversation. Because sometimes when we're in the beginner's mindset, we get confused about why we're asking questions, and we maybe think they're for the project, but they might actually be to fulfill a curiosity we have. And sometimes what we then end up doing is poking and prodding and prying a little bit too deep. And most of us who are service designers do not have the training that if a person is significantly distressed, that we would know what to do in that kind of situation, that we would be able to be actually very useful in that situation. So I see designers sometimes becoming a little bit too forensic and kind of drawing out of people way too many things. And in Vicky Reynolds' work, she talks about that we might not actually need to ask people how they've suffered, but we might need to ask them how they've resisted and how they've survived. Or we might not need to ask them much at all, because those stories have already been lovingly documented many times. So I think there's kind of that side of things of our ethical curiosity.
The way I interpret this, and I think it has been said before on the show, and if I recall correctly, we're opening potentially some wounds without having the skills to actually also heal them and close them. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
The other aspect of this is that all communities, or at least communities that I am part of or have worked with, have their own ways of gathering together and kind of ways of doing things and protocols and processes, especially in cultural spaces. And sometimes if we come in with this kind of beginner's mindset, we don't have enough of a sense of what some of those protocols or practices might need to be. I call it kind of scaffolding safety, which is like we have to need to have put a few things in place ahead of especially bringing people together in groups can be really wild. Like it can go quite badly, particularly if we haven't done enough of that preparation before we get people together around understanding who they are, what they might need, the likelihood of conflict, and kind of preparing folks for their participation.
How badly can it go? What have you seen?
Content warning for folks here. There was a process that someone ran that triggered someone's psychosis who died after that process. So we're not talking about like someone's angry. We're talking about like quite significant distress, and maybe asking people to revisit past harm without appropriate support or new harm, particularly when we just kind of put people together who might be likely to harm each other. There are really serious consequences to that, that spin off into people's lives. So I think this is something actually to take really seriously. And, another consequence, which I also think is worth thinking about, particularly here in Australia, we're seeing some really big changes to the design market. Like we've had a whole bunch of design agencies shut down. And one thing I'm thinking about in that is if designers can't behave more responsibly in some of these contexts, we just might stop getting invited to be a part of this work. And I think that would be a real shame because we do have something to offer, but have to work a little bit on the kind of delivery and the sensitivity of that sometimes.
When I was preparing for our conversation, I was thinking like the situation feels a lot like being the fish in the water where we're maybe, well, probably unaware of the things we're unaware of. How do we, what are your strategies to get out of the water and become conscious of the water?
Oh, that's a good question. I think a couple of things maybe is where we can start. So the first one, total shameless self-promotion, is to do my scope of practice exercise and reflect on the things that you know how to do and how you know how to do them. The areas where you think you might maybe need to partner with others and some things that are maybe off limit. Because I think even just understanding our current scope of practice can maybe be a way that we can kind of better evaluate what we're being asked to do through the lens of our current competency and maybe some kind of extra things that we might want to learn. I think there's also a big thing about creating the kinds of relationships with our colleagues, our clients and communities we're working with who can say things to our faces and not just behind our backs. Because the ways that I've learned these lessons the best is when we've had the right relationship and someone's actually stood up and said, I don't think you've got the right skills to do this, or I'm feeling really angry about how you've overlooked this whole thing that we're doing over here, or I don't think that's the right tool for this. And to kind of just meet that with a bit of humility and be like, you know what? I think you might be right. And I need to take like a little bit of a step back from this process or this activity and think about how I can be a bit more skillful, or how we can do it a little bit more differently. And then the third thing I think is really powerful is reflective practice and supervision. So when we are kind of starting out, and I don't mean starting out just in our careers, we might be starting out in a new context or a new project. Design doesn't necessarily have baked into it really strong reflective practice. Maybe some of us do it, but maybe it's a bit casual, kind of.
But it's sort of
it used
away.
Yeah. Yeah. And, supervision is a particular context, whether we get that from our colleagues or get that externally, where we can actually think out loud together about what we're doing. And sometimes that allows a more experienced practitioner to just gently notice and be like, hey, how do you reckon that's going to go? And then actually be able to do a little kind of bit of risk mitigation ahead of that.
You inspired me, and I'm making a mental note of what we do or what we can do in our circle community to actually introduce back design critiques as an ongoing practice. But that's a mental note. I want to zoom into something that you mentioned. Two of the practices of finding people who can be honest with you sort of in the moment and be a mirror. And the other one, like having a reflective practices, doing design critiques. Those are practices that happen after you've started. So potentially you've already taken a wrong turn, which still is valuable to reflect upon. The thing I'm interested in is sort of the start. You mentioned your scope of practice exercise. Can you walk us through, like, what would we do? What are some of the questions that it would help us ask to make sure, like, it never is a guarantee, but it helps us to become more aware of the things, of shining a light on our blind spots. So can you walk us through what we would do?
Yes, I can. And before I do that, I just want to mention that in my mind and practice, design critique is a little bit different from the kind of supervision and reflective practice I'm thinking about, where you might also do that at the beginning of a project or even before you say yes. as a means of kind of working through and evaluating the appropriateness of us for that thing. So a few places that I would start. So I get a lot of emails and project requests of things that I immediately know that's not my project. I should not be doing that project. I am not best for that project, but I maybe know who is. So I'd really like to kind of send it that way. And a few things that I'm thinking about at that point is there specific cultural, community specific knowledge that this project really calls for, that I have or don't have? So I think that's kind of one question. I think even just a question of like, is this work needed? Like, who thinks it's needed? Is it just the client that thinks it's needed, or is it also the folks who are going to be really impacted that kind of think it's needed? And do I need to be the person that leads it? Because how we might answer those two questions could be different, right? Like our first answer might be, yes, that project's needed, but I'm maybe not the person to lead it, but I want to support it. So what would be an appropriate role for me? And maybe it's like in our stage metaphor that we often use for thinking about services. I think we can also kind of think about that in this beginning phase of saying, well, maybe I'm not best for being kind of in the limelight of this project, but I could work behind the stage. I could work behind the scenes. I still have something to offer to this project. And the scope of practice, I think, is a very effective document for individuals, but also for teams, that when we get a new project, that we can maybe first individually reflect on like our readiness or our ability to do this work. Because there might also be situations where we do have a lived experience, but we haven't worked into that lived experience in a way that it would actually make it safe enough for us to use that in the work. Because sometimes we go willingly into places that we have lived experience, and then it's very destabilizing to actually be trying to lead that work because maybe we haven't learned enough skills about kind of how to hold ourselves and protect ourselves in those spaces.
Let's double click on what you said. So, for instance, the question, should this actually be done, or right, who needs it? I like that question. I can imagine that in practice it's really challenging because nothing is either a yes or a no. Like there are so many, maybe even conflicting interests. Like you have a whole internal dialogue. Like it's going to help these people, but it might harm these people. It's going to be good for society, and it might like. I'm sure that there are a lot of. Can you give an example of a conversation that you had with yourself where it wasn't a clear yes or no, and how did you sort of weigh those elements? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I had a request recently to do a project, and the project was, I won't give too many details as not to breach any kind of confidentiality, but I'll give enough that I think will give us a sense of this. It was in a context I don't usually work in, and was also in a context that was predominantly an Indigenous-led context as well. So the request came in, my first kind of alarm bell was like, oh, I think this is probably not what I'm best for because I don't really know this context other than through lived experience, and it's not an area of my lived experience I actively work with. Am I going to be the right person because it's going to require cultural knowledge that I, don't have as a non-Indigenous person? But there was a very, very, very strong interest and appeal coming from an Indigenous person who was asking for this work to be happening. So I sort of thought, I should at least talk to her on the phone and kind of see what's happening and see what I could do and whether there is a role for me here. And as I started to think more about the project and learn more about the project, I thought, maybe I could do it, but I would need to co-facilitate it. So here's co-facilitation happening again. So I reached out to a colleague of mine who is a Aboriginal, a Wiradjuri man, and said to him, what do you reckon about doing this together? Because I don't really feel like I can do this on my own. And we're about halfway through the project, and it's been awesome to kind of lean on each other and lean on different kinds of expertise. But that's one that my first hunch was to say, no, not me. My second hunch was to talk to the person a little bit more rather than just sending them off to another practitioner. And it has in this case turned out well because of the co-facilitation.
So what made the scale tip to the side where you said, yes, I am going to engage in this process?
Look, I think to be really honest, sometimes there are commercial things happening. Like I have a small business and I do need to do some work sometimes. But I could also see that actually there was already so much knowledge in this group of people, these workers, these staff members, that I could see maybe my role would be a bit more of a hosting kind of role and creating an environment where their knowledge could just come out and be shared. And that I had a colleague, First Nations colleague, that I could walk alongside through that process. If I hadn't have had that, then no, it wouldn't have been a project that I would have been able to competently do.
Is the bringing on a co-facilitator a potential loophole in this, where people might say, I don't have the cultural experience, but I can always bring somebody on who does and make them part of the team, and then you can say yes to anything. Like, again, there's a tension there.
Yeah, and big consultancies do this all the time. They kind of do these sneaky proposals. So that's a thing. And I think it matters that we already have some relationships. Like I have been working in and supporting and trying to be in really active solidarity with quite a lot of First Nations work. So I trusted that some of my existing relationships and knowledge might be strong enough to be allowed to be in the room, but that I would also stay actively aware enough of the places where I was maybe overstepping or sort of trying to take over and kind of reeling it back. But you make it, I think, a really important point.
And what does this mean for service design professionals who are just starting out in their careers, where they don't have, I don't know, maybe they want to work with children's hospitals, but they don't have kids, they've never worked in a healthcare setting, but they are very passionate to make a meaningful change there?
I think one of the really important things for folks starting out who are eager is to examine our intentions. Like there might be some contexts where our intentions are really good, like, children's hospital, like probably a really important place to improve services. What worries me more is hearing about service designers that have a savioristic kind of mindset of wanting to go into communities that they are very much not a part of, and kind of assert their worldview and their ideas and save the people in those contexts. That's the thing I feel very nervous about. And I wonder if there's an approach when we're starting out too, to say, like, where are the places that we stand? What are the things we care about? What are the communities that we're part of? And is there opportunity to work more closely into those areas, as opposed to what I think universities have kind of accidentally done for many years, which is reinforce the kind of exciting other or social good projects, which folks tend to get very excited about. But sometimes sort of go stumbling into them and don't necessarily have very positive impacts on the communities, and it can be quite damaging to the practitioner as well. But I think it's walking alongside as, again, like that you have to have someone, maybe a more senior colleague, walking alongside you and kind of not letting you fall into a pit of snakes, because that project that I talked about before, I had beautiful colleagues at the time, but they did not look after me and they did not support me and were not kind of there because they'd never done a project like that either. So it was kind of new to everyone. It was very hard as like a 19-year-old to be learning about a very intense context and having my every part of me be kind of moved all about and not necessarily know how to put that back together again.
I can see how bringing on what's the opposite of the apprentice? The guide? I don't know. What is the opposite of the apprentice? The guide?
Sage, the
I don't
oh,
know.
master's a gross word, but yeah,
Yeah,
something.
somebody with more experience, somebody with
Yeah.
more lived experience. And of course, you can combine those two elements, like lived experience within specific communities, but also lived experience in design, in the design
Yeah, I think
process,
technical
right?
experience. Yeah.
Exactly. Um, at the start of our conversation, you gave an example of a doctor who's able to sort of clearly indicate that something is outside of their scope of practice.
Yeah.
The benefit and maybe downside of being a doctor is that you actually get a degree and it's pretty specified what you know and don't know.
Yes.
Design couldn't be further away from that reality. It's super messy, it's very subjective, it's personal. Although we are
Yeah.
getting degrees and schools are popping up, so it's I don't know if it's getting better, but there is change. How
Mm.
do we know what is within the scope of practice for a service design professional?
I think it varies, right? Like it varies on who the person is, right? And
Mm-hmm.
like where they got their training for and what flavor that training was. Like it's so very varied, exactly what we learn to do. I think even from a technical perspective, though, maybe there are some technical skills that are quite generic to service designers, hey? Like maybe some things we know how to do or some ways we generally do them. Like we could probably say, for most service designers within the scope of practice is to work, from design research through to definition through to prototyping through to some kind of implement. But, some service designers have never done
Mm-hmm.
implementation and
Mm-hmm.
they have no knowledge of implementation science, and that wouldn't be in their scope of practice. So I suppose from a process perspective, we might even draw where our expertise starts and ends, even just in terms of that kind of linear process of what generally happens in a service design project, let alone then the more specialized skills. Like you brought up kids hospitals before. Working with children in design, especially in co-design, is a niche skill and also requires us to have child safe knowledge as well, so that we're looking after kids. For me, in my scope of practice, I have working with kids as a something I can only do with the right partners. So I have a associate who's a pediatric psychologist, and I really trust them, if we're going to do a project together, that they will hold on to their deep clinical knowledge and their child safe knowledge of working with kids and working with kids in like creative, interesting ways, and that I can bring more of what I'm good at as a designer to that process as well.
Bringing in trained professionals, right? They can be accredited or certified or whatever, but people who actually have spent some time learning about the fundamentals, the theories, and also put it into practice. That is, yeah. When you were sharing this, I was thinking back to a conversation with Simon Clatworthy, who co-wrote the book on design materials, the materials of
Okay.
service design.
Mm.
And I really subscribe to that idea of service design where we bring design back in and you can actually say that you are experienced in storytelling as a design material,
Mm.
or you're
Mm.
experienced in building relationships. And that makes it a lot easier if you adapt that kind of perspective on design to say, we need somebody with deep expertise in making clay models. And then it
Yeah.
becomes clear where your skills start and end. And then it's the same with a doctor who knows I'm not a physiotherapist, right? I know stuff about bones, but I
Yeah.
don't know anything about the rest of the body. So I think, yeah, no, go ahead. I see you want
No,
to
I
add.
I wonder, when you were talking about materials and sort of gave the example of storytelling or building models or these kinds of like craft based or material based practices, I think that's okay to a point, and then it stops being so useful because it's too generic. And I'll give you an example. We could say, I'm really skilled in storytelling, But depending on our like positionality in the world, who we are, that doesn't mean that it's going to be appropriate for us to like waltz off to, another country and start helping those folks tell their stories, because actually maybe the culturally grounded or the community specific ways of storytelling are really kind of different to what we have known and learned. And, I think what I'm kind of circling around is maybe sort of going back to what you said earlier, which is challenging this kind of notion of we bring the materials, we bring the process, because there's always context where that stops being so okay, and then at worst becomes quite a colonizing thing where we kind of show up with our way, and that can kind of shut down and limit and constrain the other ways that are kind of in that place. And I really would love for many more designers and service designers to bring their kind of tools and materials in a kind of humble way that acknowledges that they have purpose and they can be really useful, but they often need to be adapted to be useful. And like, who better to help us out with that than people who understand that context or community really deeply.
Thank you for highlighting that. And that is a good point. I do think that, for instance, for a doctor, it's no different. And I think there are a lot of situations in which a general practitioner, not having a culturally sensitive mindset, is going to do more harm than good, right? So it's not. I don't think it's just for design. It's super important in design, right?
Definitely not. But accountability comes into this as well, because one of the things around, and I'm not saying necessarily that design should be a licensed profession, but it's very hard for us to be held to account by communities, clients, anyone really, because we are so unspecific about what we know how to do that how would someone actually hold us accountable to kind of saying, hey, you said this was in your scope of practice and you could competently do this. You actually haven't done that for us. We'd like to have a conversation with you about that. We don't often set that up with people to kind of let them know. I mainly work in health, and something that's happened to me a lot of times is people assume I'm a doctor, which I'm definitely not. And sometimes we'll just like start asking me medical advice or assuming that I'm going to be able to make a referral for them. So it's become increasingly important when I start out a new process to let people know exactly what my professional background is, what I can and can't do, and who else in the process might be available to kind of connect up for some of those extra skills, because you might reasonably expect that someone working in health service design is a clinician.
I think the accountability aspect also has a lot to do with us knowing and defining what good looks like, right? What is good design? I don't think we are having enough conversations around that, and especially taking ethical implications into that equation, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yes. That's important.
One thing that was on my mind when considering the scope of practice is going mindlessly into a sensitive context. That's something that we should try to avoid. At the same time, I do speak to a lot of practitioners who are either on the side of being too insecure about what they can bring to the table to being overconfident. Like if they are overconfident, most likely it's like unconscious things. So the thing that I was wondering about, like, is there a risk that becoming more aware of your scope of practice actually increases the imposter syndrome and sort of prevents people to participating in helping a situation than they could?
It's a really interesting thought, and what it makes me think of is the cultures that we have in our teams and in our organizations and in our friendships with other practitioners, because I definitely have friends and colleagues who undersell what they can do, or they feel very nervous about their worthiness to be in a certain, and they are usually such skilled people that we deeply want to be in those contexts. So I wonder if it's less about scope of practice as a concept and more about the ways we kind of hold each other when we're in our organizations, when we're in teams. And I know that, as a design leader in the past, sometimes I've noticed that there'll be a person in my team who keeps underselling themselves or keeps, not being able to notice and value and connect with the things they do know how to do. So I actually wonder if that's more of a thing around leadership and peer support than it is the notion of a scope of practice, particularly if we don't see scope of practice as a static thing, like we do one and that fixes us in like a bad personality test, but rather that it's something that we revisit honestly, particularly because there's been times for me, in my career, particularly over the last couple of years, I've been doing a lot more medical research, and this is not something one I ever thought I would do, and I don't know very much about it, and it's definitely left me feeling a little bit like, well, should I be here? Like, what am I
Mm-hmm.
bringing, and what's my role here? And if I am going to be here, and if folks have said they want me to be here, then what are some areas of my scope of practice I might want to look at and kind of deepen some areas of skill, or say actually there are skills I'm going to continue not to have, but I know my colleague over there has them, and I want to make sure I'm more frequently working with them because I know this about myself, that this is going to continue to be a thing I don't really understand. But it's a valid point that you raised. Like I hadn't thought so much about that, and I am going to think about that more.
I don't know if it's a risk, but a scenario that I could see playing out is that the people who are already humble and self-aware, especially lean towards a tool like this to become even more self-aware and self-conscious, versus the people who actually need this, would shove it to the sides. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
I mean, another interesting thing that I've been noticing when I first published this article that was about the scope of practice, I actually had quite a few young designers writing to me and saying, oh, I'm so glad I have this because my organization has been expecting me to work in a whole bunch of spaces that I actually don't have the knowledge, skills, or practice to work in. And I have no strong way of advocating for that. And now I have this external tool that I can kind of take to them that wasn't something they just came up with. Particularly, another thing that a lot of younger designers and many designers were saying too is that now that lived experience is such a focus in our work, as it should be, our bosses, our colleagues have started to assume that they should just have access to our lived experience, especially if it's a visible lived experience, and haven't been really talking to us about whether that is something we even use in our scope of practice. And if we are going to use that part of ourselves, like what support would we reasonably need to do that? So I kind of see it more as a tool for advocacy and accountability and continuous growth. But it could, like all tools, be kind of used to be, limiting and actually not so useful.
Like you say, as with all tools, they can be used for good and for bad. Where do you hope this conversation, or how do you hope it will evolve in the coming years?
I mean, I'm already really excited by some of the ways it has already started to evolve. My friend Leah Lockhart, who's in Scotland, has been running a series of community sessions to get folks kind of reflecting on their scope of practice and having some really cool, creative and like courageous conversations about that among friends and colleagues and peers who want to work more responsibly together. So that's super exciting to see that that's already happening. I've also been seeing quite a few design agencies take this up in teams or across teams to sort of say, how could we actually make this more of our regular practice? I would hope that we maybe come to a place with design where we understand that we cannot go on practicing with like no clear defined scope of practice, and that we have that to some extent, whatever that ends up looking like. And that it sort of stays alive and it helps us make good decisions like for ourselves and others, and it doesn't leave, I guess I connect to the little me of it was really scary to do that project and I don't think we should be putting people in those situations where we don't have the right kinds of supports, because it's, one, not a good way to do good work, but it also has, very real harms and consequences for practitioners.
I can imagine that something like this is already helping service design professionals to advocate for the resources they need in order to deliver on the promise of their work, right? So not going into a specific project, like that's an outcome as well, but you could also use this to say, I need somebody who's more experienced in the craft, who's somebody who's experienced in the specific community, and put that down as a brief, right?
And it might be, we don't always have the budget we want to have to bring in like someone with very deep technical knowledge, for example. So I was talking to a colleague the other day who was doing a piece of work in the disordered eating space. Again, I'm not going to say any details about that other than the context. And they had said, we can't have a technical expert be a core part of our team, but we have booked 4 separate sessions with them so that they can be with us at key points along the process, including our planning, maybe after our first round of research, maybe as we're starting to plan for workshops and we need to think about things like distress protocol and, these types of practices, so that we at least have some of that greater depth of practice there to put some guardrails around us if we do happen to be the people doing the work. And advocacy, I think, is such an important element of this. And also being able to learn when we're being asked to do things deceptively. So a couple of times throughout my career, I've been asked to do something that got framed as service design. It was actually conflict mediation. It was actually surveillance of staff. It was actually 2 executives having an elaborate fight with each other. And I think sometimes when we get more skillful at noticing what a project is trying to be, and then in our first kind of research sessions or gatherings, when we start noticing the tone of that, we might get better at putting our finger on that and saying, that's conflict. Conflict needs particular processes. Maybe I'm not the person, so I know that, and I've now got a good network of conflict mediators that I could maybe draw upon.
What does it require? Because I think it happens a lot that projects turn out different than what the scope was on paper. What does it require to say at some point, like, this doesn't align with what we said it would be, and I need to step away?
Yeah, and this is hard too, because I don't want to be naive about that we all have access to the same choices, because some of us are in contexts where, for financial reasons, for safety reasons, maybe we just have to say yes. So I'm not talking to those folks or shaming them for saying yes, actually, because I think that is a very real situation. But for those of us who do get to have a little bit more choice, I think on the more consulting, freelancing agency side, maybe thinking about our project designs and whether actually we build in more of scoping ahead of doing other work that allows us to kind of get into the context. Because as you say, I can think of very few projects that ended up being the project I thought they were going to be. And a few projects, luckily, I'd set up in a way that I, contract-wise, could step away and there not be serious repercussions for doing that, because I was like, this is actually not the project and I'm not the person to be doing that. And yeah, sometimes we have the ability to do that, sometimes we don't. And sometimes we're just in way too deep and we're kind of flailing our arm around being like, is there someone who can help me out here? And certainly in a lot of my work where I'm providing supervision to folks, sometimes it's in that moment where they're like, oh my gosh, I've ended up in a project I have no idea how to lead and my colleagues aren't being very helpful. And sometimes I might be the person to help them, and sometimes I also might not be, and I might be able to connect them up with someone else who can support them in a more kind of acute moment of, oh my gosh, what do I do? How do I get through? That happens as well.
And I can attest to that from what I've been hearing. I think in being a design professional and service design professional, it's so important that you have people around you who you can trust, who will be honest to you, whether it's just one or you have a community of peers. It's like, I would say it's essential to have that support network, because shit will hit the fan. You will get self-conscious and you will be drowning, and you need people around you who can help you in those situations.
Yeah, I love that you've named that. And sometimes it's not our direct colleagues either, because we might be all swimming in the same water and thinking what we're doing is okay. And sometimes I've noticed the best support I've gotten is from someone who's outside my context, who's like, sorry, what are you doing? And then I kind of explain it to them and they're like, oh no, like that, no, that's really bad. That's wrong. Whereas like as colleagues, we've kind of deluded ourselves together, and we're swimming around in that same water that you described before.
People find community, find peers. They are there. You're not alone.
Yeah.
You never are. So, Gaia, one of the things, or the thing that I like to end our conversation with is, it's very tempting to look for the right answers, but I find it much more interesting to look for better questions. What is the question that you would like us to think about after this episode?
Oh, I'm sure folks have their own questions through listening to this episode. So I think honor those questions that you already have through listening to this episode. But my question I want to ask is a question that comes from Vicky Reynolds, which is the question, what am I best for?
That's a good question. I like it. I love it. Thank you. Thanks for coming on, sharing your story with us, giving us some practical advice on how we can become better, more responsible design professionals. I think that's really important to mature our field and to make progress. So thanks again.
Thanks for having me.
You know, this conversation really got me thinking about my own scope of practice. I might not work in sensitive environments like hospitals, but I do talk to a lot of people who share their struggles and challenges. It made me wonder, am I always the right person to be having those conversations? And if not, who should I bring on board? I think KA's emphasis on self-reflection and awareness is something we can all benefit from, no matter what kind of design work we do. So let's keep those questions coming and keep pushing ourselves to be more responsible and ethical in our practice. A big thank you to KA for sharing their wisdom and insights with us today. If you've enjoyed today's conversation, you can do me one big favor. Click the like button on this video and leave a short comment if you haven't done so already. Not to feed the algorithm, but to let me know whether or not you're appreciating the topics that we're addressing here on the show. Finally, before we part ways, please take a moment to reflect and celebrate that by joining us today, you have directed your attention towards learning and growing as a professional. So, from everyone who you are going to impact through your work, thank you for taking the time and making the commitment. My name is Mark Fontijn, and I look forward to having you with us again for a new conversation on the Service Design Show. Take care and see you soon.